Hey, how's it going, everyone? So for today's video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the rundown of how you're going to do an average lift on a vehicle. So we're going to be lifting this 2020 Jeep Wrangler with a 2.5-inch lift. The first thing you need to do is you need to kind of take everything out and lay it out. So what I like to do is lay everything out in the positions that it's supposed to be in. So this is just a basic 2.5-inch lift. So it's a spring lift versus if it was a spacer lift or a drop-down bracket lift. So this is actually what's considered a suspension lift. Now there's a couple other ways to lift vehicles. One way would be to remove the stock spring and add a spacer of varying height to increase ride height, and then either add a spacer for the shock absorber or to lengthen the shock absorber. The other way to lift these would be to provide a spacer in between the body mount to increase that. That's kind of an old school way of doing it, not a very good one because you stretch wiring harnesses and shift cables and stuff, and it's not ideal. Another way to do that would be to replace the spindle or the steering knuckle in this case, because this is a straight axle suspension vehicle. If you replace this, what you do is you're moving the center line of the hub further down, which would increase the vehicle's ride height. You can do that with lowering kits as well. Those are fine. They don't really affect the suspension geometry or how the suspension is going to articulate, and they just give you enough ground clearance for tires and wheels, but they don't necessarily address the fact that now your center of gravity of the vehicle is now much higher. So what we're doing is the best option is that's going to be actually replace the suspension components. So we're doing a spring lift, 2.5-inch longer springs, longer shock absorbers, and a different lower control arm. The lower control arm, though, is to take into account the position of this brake line. It moves it farther in for the longer travel. Conveniently, this lift is enough to where we don't have to lengthen our brake lines. That is one thing that you do have to consider with lifting is a vehicle is when you do lift it up, these brake lines can get pulled taut, and you don't want that ideally, especially when it's on full droop or the suspension is completely sagged out. This lift, we don't have to worry about that. It's just enough to where that's going to be an issue. So we'll go through the parts that we have to change and the directions. All right, so it's key with these lift kits to actually follow the directions. Like I said, I like to lay out all the parts so that I know where they're all going, but the directions are really pretty important. Now, any aftermarket component's going to come with directions that are two ways. They're all either going to be text with no pictures, or they're going to be like these ones where they're IKEA directions, where they really don't give you a ton of verbiage of what's going on. But one of the things that you do need to pay attention to is, for instance, on here, it's showing that there's two. So there's two for E, there's two for F, but in reality, there's actually 4 individual springs. Now, the reason why the manufacturer does that is to account for weight distribution in the vehicle. So if we look at each individual number, we can see that there's different positions for each spring that comes in the kit. Now, this is important because what the manufacturer does when they're designing springs is they take into consideration the weight of the driver on the left side of the vehicle. So with anywhere between 100 and 300 pounds of driver in the vehicle, that is going to affect how the vehicle rides. So when you measure ride height, sometimes the left side of the vehicle is going to be just slightly higher than the right side due to the fact that the spring is going to be a little bit stiffer, a little bit higher sprung to allow for that weight. So in this case, we have a red tag for our left, and we have a blue tag for our right. And if we go to the back of the vehicle, with all our parts laid out here, we have the same thing. We have the tags for each side, and that is indicating that the position of the spring. Now, you might not be able to notice a difference other than the fact that they have the tags like this, but typically one's going to be just slightly taller than the other. The other thing to note too is when you take these off, if they do have part number tags, look at the ones that are coming off so that you can get an orientation of how these go, whether or not where the coils locate, and then whether or not where the perches locate as well. So we're going to start tearing this down, and then we'll get to installing the new component. The vehicle that we're lifting has a straight axle, meaning that the drive axle is live and supported by control arms and is separated by the springs from the chassis. So when you have this type of suspension and you're doing any type of spring work, it's best to do some sort of jack stand. Now, because I'm on a lift, I'm using pull jacks, which are essentially a really long jack stand to support the axle assembly. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking off the control arm bolts and loosening everything loosening the shocks, loosening the sway bar links to then drop the axle down enough to get the springs out. So at this point, I'm going to use time lapse and the voiceover land to be able to give you the rundown of how to remove the components to get the springs separated from the vehicle. At this point, I'm removing the shocks, sway bar links, lower control arms, loosening the upper control arms and the drag link to allow that front axle to drop down and to safely be lowered down on the pull jacks to loosen and remove the springs. This will de-energize the springs in a safe manner to not allow them to shoot out of the vehicle. You can use spring compressors to remove them, but I find it's usually best to do it this process of loosening all the components and then using the pull jacks to lower down each axle side slowly left and right to where you can get the springs out safely. With the stock springs removed, you can kind of tell the height difference. We got it, you know, roughly 2.5 inches that this taller spring is going to be taking up. So one of the things that I've shown on the time lapse is, even though we're only replacing the 2 lower control arms, you still go through and loosen up all of the suspension links. So the 2 top control arms plus this track bar needs to be loosened up. What that does is that allows the suspension to droop down and you're able to get the springs out of it. Also too, you go to retighten these up at ride height after the suspension's been jounced once or twice. What that does is that unbinds up these bushings and it makes everything operate at the new height that the vehicle is going to be at a little bit better. You won't prematurely wear out the bearings as quickly. I also went through and loosened up and disconnected the different electrical connections on this diff. This particular vehicle has an electric locker, so there's an electrical connection right there, as well as it has an electric axle disconnect for when you're in 2-wheel drive. So both of those had to be undone. The wiring should be long enough, but this is one of those things that you want to undo, get the vehicle at ride height and make sure that the wiring, your diff vent, and your brake lines are all at the correct length so that the vehicle won't have these being limiting straps and causing it to get stuck. So we'll continue on with putting the springs in, the bump stopping increasers, and finish up this lift. So I'm going to use time lapse again to speed up the process of installing the new springs, shocks, sway bar links, and bump stop increasers. Before I put the springs in, I installed the lower control arms loose in the frame and on the axle, as well as left the upper control arms and the track bar loose. This will allow me to move the axle around and get the springs in their correct perches on the frame end and on the axle end. This can be kind of difficult on these 5-link design suspensions. When the vehicle's at ride height, the axle via the pivot points is the farthest point away from the frame that it will be, but as it goes either up or down in suspension travel, it'll get closer to the frame. This can allow the spring to bow out, which can be difficult to install, especially with it at full droop right now, so it takes a lot of patience to install these. So at this point, I've got the lift taken care of in the rear. It's very similar to the front. Straight axle front, straight axle rear. You just got to drop the control arms, loosen them to be able to get the new springs in and out. Conveniently, this one doesn't need any special tools to compress the springs. As long as you drop the axle low enough, you have enough clearance to get the springs out. So what I've done now for the front and for the rear is I am going to go through and leave the control arm bolts loose, and I'm going to take it over to the flat rack. So I'm going to put the wheels and tires on it and put it on the flat rack, because then that will allow the bushings to settle. It'll jounce the car a couple times, and then I'll go through and final torque all of the bushings that are going to move with the pivots. Now I have tightened up the shocks and the sway bar links because those are keeping the springs in place. But just going backwards a couple feet and then back up onto the flat rack right there isn't going to be a big enough deal to where there's going to be any issues with these loose, and it will be enough to where I'll have jounced the suspension. One of the other things you want to look at too is, now that this is about where the suspension is going to be with it at full travel, is you want to make sure all the electrical is loose, diff vents loose, any brake lines. So these are our parking brake cables right here, but they're nice and loose and not bound up. Same with our brake lines as well. I mean, you go front and rear with that. If you have an issue with like the brake line being too tight, you may need to get longer brake lines or get a drop down bracket. Those can work, but then you have to bend the hard lines up here. Anything where like you can get a little bit more clearance. So like this bracket, for instance, the brake line was getting a little tighter. If you're able to bend that up just slightly, you're able to get a little bit of clearance out of the brake line. So what we'll do right now is we'll get the wheels and tires put back on it and get it over to the flat rack and then torque everything down. Okay, so at this point I moved the Jeep from the 2-post lift to the flat rack. So now we're gonna go to each corner and jounce it. This is to try to settle the suspension. And then from here, we will go through and torque all the suspension components. So with everything jounced, it's still loose. We'll get it torqued up. The directions conveniently have on the last page all of the torque settings for all the stuff that we've removed. So I'm going to go through now, torque everything up. From here, then we'll go and align the vehicle. So at this point, the lift kit is installed, everything's torqued. What I like to do now is go for a drive around the block just to make sure everything's settled and double check the torque of everything. And then we go to aligning the vehicle. Unfortunately, I can't align it right now because we still have the stock wheels and tires on it. I'm waiting for the larger wheels and tires to come from the tire shop. So it'll be about a day or two before I can align it. I'll show you some alignment tips and tricks in a future video. But other than that, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.